A comparative analysis of George W. Bush's political rhetoric in the crises of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina.
Our unity, our union, is the serious work of leaders and citizens in every generation. And this is my solemn pledge. I will work to build a single nation of justice and opportunity. I know this was in our reach because we are guided by a power larger than ourselves, who creates us equal in His image. And we are confident in principles that unite and lead us onward.
In times of national crisis, presidential figures are often required to build a particular rhetoric in order to attempt to unite a nation whose collective national identity has been threatened. The types of response formed by the president depends on the nature of the crisis itself. As Kevin McHugh explains, in crisis rhetoric, the emphasis is upon defense and/or perceived rhetorical attacks on the president. Whereas in a natural disaster address, the rhetoric is about the issues related to the disaster and those affected by it. Disasters have shown to be opportunities for presidents to demonstrate their effective and compassionate leadership in order to console victims and demonstrate their strengths in repairing damage on a local and national scale. Presidents have in turn become increasingly accountable for the effectiveness of the response. During his term as president, Bush was required to demonstrate these skills in response to two important crises: the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the disastrous events of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Bush's crisis rhetoric post 9/11 used the construction of a physical enemy to project discontented feelings produced from the crisis away from the president and onto an external figure, drawing the focus onto the terrorists and their otherness. This rhetoric was integral to Bush's response to the September 11 attacks, and one in which he was comfortable using. In his response to the crisis of Hurricane Katrina, Bush was not able to use the same rhetoric, leading to an ineffectual response to the crisis. His response to 9/11 and Katrina differed, as he was not able to form a rhetoric of good versus evil or hero versus enemy for Katrina, as he could in New York due to the absence of a physical enemy or group of people to blame for the event. His reaction to the hurricane demonstrated a lack of affirmative action, contrasting with the fast-developing war rhetoric used in the aftermath of 9/11. Not able to form the same response that he did for 9/11, Bush's response to Katrina was far more delayed, and this caused detrimental effects to the New Orleans community and to Bush's own reputation. Alongside mainstream news media, discussion and political commentary, editorial and political cartoons provide perspective on how Bush's responses and rhetoric to these crises were perceived. The form of political cartoons allows for stronger criticism through imagery, as the form allows the creator to push past the boundaries, usually restricting written or spoken commentary on events and public figures. Section 1. Bush's initial responses to the crises. When responding to crises, Douglas Madsen and Peter Snow explained that times of crisis thus enhance the likelihood that followers will want to invest increased faith in leaders, see leaders as more powerful, and identify more of their leaders as a coping mechanism. Prior to the events of the 9/11 attacks, Bush generally was not perceived as a strong, charismatic leader that people would place their faith in during times of crisis or external threat, with low approval ratings common during his first year as president. Initial presidential responses to crisis events are important because they set a precedent for how the crises are reported, raising questions about whether the needs of the nation will be met. In his address to the nation from the Oval Office after 9/11, Bush used the rhetoric of good versus evil to promote patriotic feelings within the nation.
Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could.
Referring to the rescue workers and local community efforts. Through his focus on the acts of everyday American citizens, Bush used the dichotomy of the goodness of Americans and the evilness of terrorists. Bush's focus upon the togetherness of the American people is important to the formation of his political rhetoric.
This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This uniting of all Americans is reinforced through the religious scripture Bush uses.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
Bush uses a collective narratorial voice in his address to bring together a country whose resolve had been shaken. In his address, he also declared that the attacks were acts of war and that there would be a monumental struggle between good and evil in which good will prevail. The rhetoric of good versus evil was an effective way of stirring up feelings of patriotism, encouraging a war mentality within the nation. When identifying the enemy within the crisis, Bush stated the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbour them. In comparison to 9/11, Bush was criticised for his slow response to Hurricane Katrina. Douglas Brinkley states, Bush acted as though he were disinterested in the natural disaster. More than any other event of his White House tenure, Bush's slow response to Katrina made Americans ask if he was a bunker commander, relying too much on cautious paper pushers such as FEMA's Michael Brown and Homeland Security's Michael Chertoff. As Bush could not create an enemy out of a natural disaster, it suggests he struggled to form a response he was familiar with. Kevin McClure argues that Bush had to employ a crisis rhetoric to the events of Hurricane Katrina due to criticism of the federal response and Bush's failure to respond in a timely manner to the natural disaster. After the criticism that Bush faced for this delayed response, he addressed these issues in his hurricane relief address to the nation. In this address, Bush focused on the need for a united country.
In the task of recovering and rebuilding, some of the hardest work is still ahead, and it will require the creative skill and generosity of a united country.
This uses similar language to the crisis rhetoric Bush employed for 9/11. In doing this, Bush attempted to provoke a similar feeling of unity, yet this feeling could not be successfully replicated due to the absence of an enemy to place the blame away from Bush and his administration, and feelings of resentment were already growing as the reality of the damage and loss became more apparent. Alongside these speeches, the press images released at the time displayed the marked difference in how Bush approached the two different crises. The images released post 9/11 placed Bush at the centre of the events. During his visit to New York City, Bush physically embraced workers. Workers started chanting in support for Bush as they flew the United States flag.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
These images of unity differ in comparison to the photos first released of Bush after Hurricane Katrina. Brinkley explains, the biggest mistake of all was one of optics. Bush chose to fly over New Orleans in Air Force One instead of doing an on-the-ground inspection, a clear sign of aloofness indeed, of fear. Making a detour above the disaster zone was the sight of a man slumming, a man in a bubble, a man deluged. Because Bush could not apply his 9/11 rhetoric to Hurricane Katrina, his response to the natural disaster was ineffectual.
Section 2. Media responses to 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. Alongside heightened press coverage and television attention focused at these crises, came a number of political cartoons that were created to commemorate, criticise and comment on these events. Political cartoons are useful to discuss as they provide a different perspective from mainstream news outlets, and their nature allows them to address events from different angles, often pushing on the boundaries of political correctness and appropriateness. Stephanie Kelly Romano and Victoria Westgate comment that political cartoons fulfill a unique function in an age of instantaneous media, as individuals are inundated with information and forced to understand and evaluate catastrophes instantaneously. Political cartoons help them make sense of situations through non-discursive, emotionally evocative content. The differences between the political cartoons that followed the events of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina demonstrate how the events of the acts of President Bush were received. In their article blaming Bush, Kelly Romano and Westgate argue that the cartoons following Hurricane Katrina targeted Bush and his administration for the worsening situation during and following the disaster. They note that the cartoons claim that Bush's personal and policy decisions were detrimental to the relief efforts, and that there was a lack of intelligence and integrity necessary for the successful handling of the situation. The political and editorial cartoons following Hurricane Katrina do not hesitate to criticize Bush and his administration, and these depictions of the event highlight multiple issues and matters of concern. John Pritchett's illustration is an example of this form of criticism. Depicting FEMA as a tortoise with Bush riding on it is similar to the image of a cowboy on his horse riding to the rescue. This emphasizes the extremely slow response that Bush and his team demonstrated. It pokes fun at Bush's ignorance at this situation and a lack of personal accountability that he acknowledged following the disaster. Amongst the editorial cartoons in the early months following the 9/11 attacks, there is a distinct lack of cartoons targeting President Bush. Instead, they tend to focus on commemorating the loss of lives and freedom. Many of these cartoons depict images of freedom and liberty being attacked by the terrorists, such as this cartoon of the Statue of Liberty being tied to one of the towers as it burned down. Donna R. Hoffman and Alison D. Howard note that only a few cartoons in the 3 years were used politically. The few editorial cartoons that were political tended to avoid criticism of the president. The nature of political cartoons and their common use is generally to critique and sometimes mock current affairs and important persons. Yet the nature of the 9/11 attacks and the fragility that the nation felt following the event meant that these cartoons had to take a different approach in the immediate aftermath, tending to be more about commemorating the victims, commenting on the attack to American freedom and liberty, and establishing the event as a significant attack on the West, likening them to those on Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Section 3. Why were the responses received so differently? The nature of the political cartoons and how they reacted to President Bush's actions were dependent on the nature of the crises themselves, as well as the mood felt towards the president's responses. After Hurricane Katrina, Bush's approval rating sank to the lowest level since he had taken office. This is in contrast to his approval ratings around the time of the 9/11 attacks. Before the terrorist attacks, 51% of Americans approved of Bush's job performance, whereas after the attacks, his approval ratings jumped to 86%. It can be argued Bush was successful in his 9/11 response because it was easier for him to construct a physical enemy, whereas he could not construct an enemy out of a natural disaster.
Thousands of dangerous killers, schooled in the methods of murder, often supported by outlaw regimes, are now spread throughout the world like ticking time bombs set to go off without warning. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
Bush's response to 9/11 aided the nation in forming a common ground in where to stand following the attacks, and the mood of the political cartoons is an example of how Bush was initially successful in rallying the nation against a common enemy. McClure remarks upon the differences between these two types of events. He explains that in events like 9/11, a human-induced crisis, identifiable human motives are present in presidential discourse for such events. Whereas, in natural disasters, no one is held directly responsible, there are no promises for justice, and there is little point in calling for retribution. To explain explanations for why Hurricane Katrina had happened, Bush described it as an act of God, using a religious rhetoric within his speeches to deflect attention away from himself. Yet, this deflection was unsuccessful, and as the political cartoons demonstrate, the reception of Bush's actions was not positive. His inability to effectively manage the situation highlighted multiple issues in his own leadership, as well as the effectiveness of his administration. As head of state, President Bush became the target for discontent and was held responsible for the failures of rescue and relief efforts. McClure argues the lack of direct human culpability, at least as is rhetorically absent in presidential addresses on natural disasters, represents an important rhetorical and situational distinction, as an exigent from presidential addresses that deal with politically motivated terrorist attacks or human accidents, and as a result, presidential remarks on disasters include unique elements and conventions that distinguish it as a presidential genre. In his memoir, Decision Points, Bush reflects, "The problem was not that I made the wrong decisions, it was that I took too long to decide." Bush states, just as Katrina was more than a hurricane, its impact was more than physical destruction. It eroded citizens' trust in their government, it exacerbated divisions in our society and politics, and it cast a cloud over my second term. It was easier for Bush to build the post-crisis rhetoric post-9/11 because the enemy, or at least the general perception of the enemy, was visible to him.
Osama bin Laden is just one person. He is representative of networks of people who absolutely have made their cause to defeat the freedoms that we understand, and we will not allow him to do so.
The enemy, the other, was foreign to America, so displaced feelings could be projected onto this figure of the enemy. Possible explanations as to why Bush's initial response to Katrina was ineffective in comparison to 9/11 could be due to the fact that he was poorly advised, misinformed, or distracted by his vacation or other presidential duties. Richard T. Sills explains that for US presidents there is an unwritten rulebook for disaster recovery, and the first rule is act fast. The second rule is send it all, because local and state officials are often reluctant to admit they need help. And the third rule is that presidents are expected to explain and console. Bush failed to follow the conduct of this unwritten rulebook. His initial response was delayed, he relied too much upon FEMA to deal with widespread disaster relief, and he came across unsympathetic for his physical displacement from New Orleans.
Ultimately, the responses and stances taken by President Bush during and following the crises of the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and Hurricane Katrina in 2005 demonstrate his inability to effectively act in times of crisis where there was no clear enemy. As demonstrated through social commentary in the form of political and editorial cartoons, Bush and his administration were actively criticized for their lack of attentiveness and action to aid the victims of the hurricane. Contrastingly, Bush was quick to act to form a rhetoric to unite the nation following the September 11 attacks. Bush successfully built on patriotic attitudes already held by US citizens to garner support. The nature of the political cartoons coincide with the national thought, as very few criticized Bush and his government, with many focusing on commemorating lives lost and displaying the enemy.
Katrina exposed serious problems in our response capability at all levels of government. And to the extent that the federal government didn't fully do its job right, I take responsibility. I want to know what went right and what went wrong. I want to know how to better cooperate with state and local government to be able to answer that very question that you asked. Are we capable of dealing with a severe attack or another severe storm? And that's a very important question, and it's in our national interest that we find out exactly what went on and so that we can better respond.
These events demonstrated President Bush's weaknesses as a leader in times of crisis where the fault could not be placed onto the figure of the other. Following the events of Hurricane Katrina, Bush's presidency struggled to recover from the damage to his reputation and suffered from increasing levels of distrust and discontent within the nation. Bush's responses to these events display the significant role of the presidential figure and the responsibility the president must recognize in times of crisis and natural disaster.